The term bootlegging has origins going as far back as the American Civil War, where soldiers would sneak alcohol into camps by hiding bottles in their pant legs or the shaft of their boot. During the Prohibition era, the word gained even more traction when hundreds or even thousands of civilians within the city began to adopt this same method of concealment to sneakily transport illegal liquor across city, county, or even state lines. But since then, the term bootleg has gone on to spread to multiple different industries. For example, the music business has bootleg recordings, which is a track or full album recording of an artist's performance that is not considered an official release. They're usually unauthorized recordings of live performances or unreleased studio material. And some of those bootleg albums would end up being spread around quite quickly and gaining the popularity of an official release. There's also corporate bootlegging, which refers to an employee working on a project for the benefit of the company without being given official managerial permission. In the world of video games, a bootleg typically refers to a counterfeit or unlicensed game that is released without the knowledge or permission of the IP holder or the certification of the console manufacturer. Bootleg video games today don't really exist in the same way that they used to back in the 90s. Mainly because game development tools are easy to acquire, and becoming a legitimate indie developer with licensed and official releases on all major platforms is often pretty painless, or at the very least, the barrier isn't as high as it was back then. Nowadays, the only real remnant of old-school bootlegging that you'll still see are those hard drives or SD cards or cartridges you can buy online that have pre-installed emulators and hundreds or thousands of games on them, traditionally called multi-carts. But back in the 90s, bootlegs covered a very wide range of products and means of manufacturing. Video game bootlegging in the early days had two primary avenues of approach: making clone consoles or making unlicensed games. Clone consoles were quite popular and plentiful. By far, the most cloned console was, unsurprisingly, the Nintendo Famicom, or NES. In fact, Famicom clones were so common they got their own special name, Famiclones. Famiclones often came from Taiwan because it's the semiconductor capital of the world, and thanks to this, it was easy to manufacture clone chips there. Early Famiclones were almost exact copies of the real Famicom, with chips manufactured by United Microelectronics Corporation, or UMC. It didn't take long for UMC to get more sophisticated with their process, however, and they eventually created something called the NES on a chip design, which allowed a single, small chip to mimic all functions of a Famicom. The result was a much cheaper manufacturing process, and Famiclone designers were able to get creative with the form factor of their consoles. The only trade-off is that the smaller chip was slightly less faithful to the performance of the original Famicom, which meant fewer games were compatible with it, but it was so much more affordable that it wasn't really a big deal. Nintendo's patents on the Famicom and NES hardware are now long expired, which means clones aren't considered illegal anymore, so you can make and sell them openly as you please, as long as there's no pirated software included with it. One of the most popular examples that you can buy right now on sites like Amazon is the Hyperkin Retron. There's also the FPGA platforms by Analog and the modular Polymega. And then there's bootleg or unlicensed games, which was a multi-step process. They often utilized assets from licensed games without the original developer's permission, and the bootleg dev would go out of their way to print copies, complete with cartridge and box, and selling it. There was an entire spectrum of unlicensed games, ranging from titles that actually didn't use anyone else's assets at all and were wholly original but just didn't receive proper certification, all the way to straight rip-offs that didn't have an ounce of originality at all and were made entirely from other games' sprites, gameplay, and music. Most games rested somewhere in the middle, between these two extremes. There were game hacks that would leave the graphics and music intact but change the gameplay from a minor to drastic degree, or they would do the opposite and keep the gameplay mostly the same and just paste new sprites over everything. There were also unlicensed ports where bootleg developers would usually use an existing game as a base and then turn it into a bootleg version of a different existing game that was only available on newer systems. At the end of the day though, while some of these bootleg games might be ambitious, most of them were ultimately still just bootlegs. Imitations and rip-offs lacking in quality compared to the real licensed products. So yeah, bootlegging could potentially be a fairly complex business depending on how you approached it. But, like all businesses, there were some specific studios or groups that stood head and shoulders above the rest. In the world of video game bootlegging, one of those studios was Hummer Team, a game developer known for the surprisingly decent quality of some of their games. Their titles were often still very janky overall, and nothing incredible compared to the likes of the best legitimate licensed games, but Hummer Team brought to the bootleg table a level of quality that few other teams in the bootlegging business were capable of. In fact, on a rare occasion, they would make unlicensed ports that played better than the official thing. I won't go over every single game that they made, but I will touch on a significant chunk of their storied gamography. But before we dive into the bootleg rabbit hole, however, I want to show you something official, the stuff in my merch store. As of right now, I have 2 shirt designs, a sliced skull, and a tribute to Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy series. I also have a beanie with my logo embroidered on it. Both shirt designs are available in lightweight fabric and heavyweight cotton. I've already received samples of everything for quality checking, and I can confirm they look great in person. If you're interested, visit mildconviction.com or check the store tab of my YouTube channel page. Thanks for listening, now let's get back to the video. So who was Hummer Team exactly? The team was founded in 1992 in Taipei, Taiwan by developer Hummer Chang, who had recently left Sachen, another Taiwanese company who was prolific in the bootlegging scene, releasing approximately 70 unlicensed games for the Famicom during their existence. He also briefly worked with Ideatech, where he contributed only to their single tennis game. According to Hummer, there were a total of 13 members in Hummer Team, but alongside Hummer himself, who was also composer and programmer for the group, there were a few other key staff, such as Silver's Lin, Kathy Chen and Carol Wu, and Chris Ho. Silver's Lin and Kathy Chen specifically came from Computer and Entertainment Inc., or C&E, another big name in bootleg games, famous for creating Shenghuo Liezhuan, or Biography of the Holy Fire, which is believed to be the first ever commercial Chinese language RPG for console. At their peak, Hummer Team would work on 2 games at the same time, occasionally 3, and turnaround on their games would average around 4 months. Once the core Hummer Team members gathered together and got the ball rolling, they soon released their first title, Jing Ke Xin Zhuan, or New Biography of Jing Ke, an RPG, and their only RPG if the rest of their projects are anything to go by, published by Supertone Electronics in 1992. Gameplay-wise, New Biography has quite a bit in common with Dragon Quest, with a few noticeable quirks, such as the comically large Chinese text scrolling across the bottom of the screen for dialogue and actions. Programming-wise, the game uses the same mapper as the aforementioned Biography of Holy Fire by C&E. Now for those who don't know, a mapper, when referring to a Famicom or NES game, is the configuration and capabilities of the cartridge's actual hardware and circuitry, because cartridge-based games are basically running on a tiny PCB. And doing a mapper hack means copying the content from one board to another to make it easier to modify. New Biography also contains mostly original music, but made on a sound engine that might not be an original creation of the team. Some of these tracks would go on to be reused in future Hummer Team games. Following up New Biography, though, would be Hummer Team's first true blue bootleg port, Street Fighter II The World Warrior, an unlicensed NES port of the iconic SNES game by Capcom. The game was published by Yokosoft, a company that focused primarily on unlicensed fighting games, also in 1992. As a testament to Hummer Team's strong dedication, even among bootleggers, this port was created on their own engine, simply called the Street Fighter II engine, which would go on to serve as the base for other fighting games they would make down the line. This unlicensed port obviously had some clear differences from the legit SNES release besides simpler graphics. For one, there's only 5 characters in the whole game: Ryu, Chun-Li, Guile, Zangief, and Dictator, who is also called Vega in the Japanese version of the games, but this port misspells his name as Vega instead. Combat mechanics are also simplified, but thankfully all characters maintain their signature moves, except Zangief, who sadly seems to be missing his iconic spinning pile driver. Games on this engine will also typically have very large and wonky hitboxes. There are other versions of this port that are renamed to Master Fighter in order to narrowly avoid copyright infringement issues, and one of those versions is Master Fighter 6-, released in 1993, which is an enhanced version with better graphics and more characters, with the addition of Blanka, Ken, Dhalsim, Sagat, Claw, Boxer, E Honda, and a recolor character for everyone, because for some reason the game isn't capable of allowing 2 players picking the same character, so this workaround is needed. As you might expect, thanks to the immense popularity of the real Street Fighter II, some of that success would bleed over to bootlegs too, making Hummer Team's unlicensed port an early home run for them. With this, they would go on to make plenty more fighting games. Now at this point I do want to mention that because Hummer Team was able to release up to 4 games in a single year, it's sometimes tricky to fully pin down the exact release order of their games within a particular year. That being said though, I am going to try and be as accurate as I can, though I might mix up the order of some games. Now the next title from Hummer Team is a notorious one. It's not a fighting game, so another new engine had to be built just for it. I'm talking about Somari, the unlicensed Sonic the Hedgehog NES port that replaced Sonic with Mario. Somari is a fascinating project because it exemplifies both the ambition of bootleggers and the shortcomings of their lack of resources, time, or experience. In regard to content, Somari was actually shockingly faithful to the original legitimate Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis. It has almost every single level, and they even gave Mario a spin dash. But the game's weaknesses lie behind the curtain. The game is extremely difficult and rife with glitches and poorly made physics. There's a punishing lack of checkpoints and continues, ruthless enemy placement, frequently repeating sections of zones, inescapable pits, and buggy programming that will cause slowdowns at high speed, and sometimes you'll just get stuck in spots. It was a frustrating experience, but despite that, it would go on to be pretty popular, especially thanks to the engine, which allowed for easy Sonic hacks to be made, including some made by Hummer Team themselves, such as Sonic 3D Blast 5, which sought to fix some of the bugs present in Somari, Sonic and Knuckles 5, which doesn't actually contain Knuckles as a playable character anyway, and The Hummer, which is a hack featuring Hummer Team's mascot. The Somari engine would go on to be a choice piece of software for other bootleg developers who would make their own games, such as the surprisingly extensive Doraemon made by Y-Sing. After Somari, Hummer Team decided to return to fighting game projects, getting as much mileage as they could out of their Street Fighter II engine. Another big fighting game franchise was taking the world by storm at that time, and it was the perfect choice for another unlicensed NES port, Mortal Kombat. It was named Mortal Kombat 2, however, to gain traction by pretending it was a sequel, which, as we've established by other titles mentioned earlier, was a common tactic for bootlegs. Hummer Team's port was actually quite faithful to the original game, but as you may imagine, the NES's hardware imposed some strict limitations that required certain changes to be made or mechanics to be removed. Special moves don't work the same here as they do in the original SNES title, such as Scorpion's spear being turned into a normal fireball, and Goro is a playable character, but he's been scaled down to the same size as the rest of the human roster. The port has 9 characters in total: Raiden, Sonya Blade, Sub-Zero, Scorpion, Kano, Johnny Cage, Liu Kang, Goro, and Shang Tsung, whose name is misspelled as Skang Tsung. Hummer Team would later go back and make an enhanced version called Mortal Kombat 2 Special, which is actually based on the real Mortal Kombat 2 instead of MK1, funnily enough, and featured all of the original 12 playable characters, and made Kintaro and Shao Kahn playable too, for a total of 14. Furthermore, special moves now work like they're supposed to, and the blood is present after being absent from the initial bootleg. Hummer Team promptly followed Mortal Kombat with another unlicensed port of a big IP, Dragon Ball, by creating Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden 2 for the NES, once again using the Street Fighter II engine. Unlike the usual ports by Hummer Team, this one was not in English and instead in Japanese. You might assume this would affect the story mode, but sadly the entire story was removed. Instead, the game only focused on arcade and versus mode. The graphics for this port are essentially a simplified version of what the original game looks like, and the same goes for the music, which is also a change of pace because the music for the Mortal Kombat port was actually mostly original. There's also a few roster changes. Goku is now a starting character and doesn't need to be unlocked, and Broly and Bojack are both absent from the game. Weirdly enough though, Bojack's henchwoman and member of the Galaxy Soldiers, Zangya, is present. I mentioned earlier another bootleg developer called Sing, who made a surprisingly thorough Doraemon hack of Somari, but they returned once again to make a hack of Hummer Team's Super Butoden 2 called Myth Struggle, which is based on the Chinese mythology novel Feng Shen Bang, or Investiture of the Gods. It's another shockingly deep hack that completely changes the graphics and sound design, and the language was changed to Chinese. The only thing that stayed the same is the base combat mechanics. Hummer Team would go on to continue their spree of unlicensed fighting games, but this time they went in a slightly different direction. So far, their fighting games have been based on actual fighting games, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Super Butoden. But this next game would end up being probably their most famous or possibly infamous game thus far, because it took a non-fighting game and turned it into one. What was this game, you wonder? Was it an adventure game, a beat-em-up, an RPG? Those would make sense to turn into a fighting game, right? Well, no, it was none of those things. The game that Hummer Team decided to turn into a fighting game was Mario Kart. Kart Fighter released anywhere between early 1994 to early 95, and it's another game running off Hummer Team's Street Fighter II engine. What's more surprising is that it's actually a pretty competent fighting game experience that features all the mechanics you might expect. Most characters have some sort of projectile, some characters have charge attacks, and some have uppercuts. There's a total of 8 playable characters: Mario, Luigi, Peach, Yoshi, Toad, Donkey Kong Jr., Koopa Troopa, and Bowser. Toad, Koopa Troopa, and Bowser have their Japanese names listed in-game, however, as Kinopio, Noko Noko, and Koopa respectively. Now, if I were more of a conspiracy theorist, I would probably assume Masahiro Sakurai got at least some inspiration for Super Smash Bros. From Kart Fighter. But of course, Nintendo wouldn't admit to it because of how openly they despise bootleggers, emulation, ROM hacks, and the like. Regardless though, Kart Fighter is a pretty solid game, especially for a bootleg that was thrown together in mere months and based off a property that isn't a fighting game at all. The chaos still doesn't stop there though. Hummer Team was on a roll with these ridiculous fighting games, and soon they'd release something even more notorious and adult-oriented: AV Bishoujo Senshi Girl Fighting. To put it simply, this game is kind of a clusterfuck. Once again, using Hummer Team's Street Fighter II engine, this game mashes together a bunch of different assets and leftovers from the group's previous fighting games, cobbled together under a motif that pays homage, I suppose, to popular manga and anime properties Sailor Moon and Ranma 1/2, which is apparent from the moment the game starts because the main menu theme is literally the Sailor Moon theme. And what makes this adult-oriented is that whenever you beat the CPU opponent on difficulty level 3 or above, you're rewarded with suggestive imagery. There's a total of 8 playable characters, and even though their names are different, they're all very obviously inspired from the previously mentioned franchises. There's Ranma, Hinako, Kodachi, and Shampoo from Ranma 1/2, Sailor Mars and Mercury from Sailor Moon, and for good measure, there's Chun-Li from Street Fighter and a character named Bunny from Hummer Team's other Street Fighter clone, Street Fighter 4. And that's still not all. A lot of the game reuses old content, such as the font, life bars, and stages from Street Fighter 4, character select screen and move commands from Kart Fighter, and the enemy AI seems to behave similarly to Mortal Kombat 2. It goes without saying at this point, but this game is a weird one, and for multiple different reasons. But it's because of that it lives on as one of Hummer Team's most recognizable and notorious titles. Next, I want to set the stage a bit here by talking about Aladdin. No, not the movie, but the NES and Genesis games. There's an unending debate about which version is better, because if you weren't aware already, they're made by totally different companies. The SNES version was developed and published by Capcom, while the Genesis version is developed by Virgin Games and published by Sega, meaning they are not ports, they are completely separate projects. The latter version is the version of choice for ports to other consoles. 3 NES versions of Aladdin are based on the Genesis version, including the one official NES release that's exclusive to Europe. Knowing this, you might assume Hummer Team followed suit, right? Well, no, actually. Hummer Team's unlicensed NES port is based on Capcom's original SNES game. I made a comment earlier in the video that you might remember, and you probably didn't even believe. I said that there was an occasion where Hummer Team made an unlicensed port that was better than the real thing, and this is it. Hummer Team's Aladdin for the NES would go down as one of their best and most popular games because it's head and shoulders above all other attempts to put the game on the console, including the official attempt by Virgin Interactive. The official version was heavily criticized for dull graphics and bad controls. It was a pale imitation to its superior Genesis counterpart. But Hummer Team's Aladdin was praised for being a more pleasant experience, visually and interactively. Of course, it's not a perfect game with small visual details missing, jumping is on the wrong button, and the physics seemingly being based on Somari, which means there's some very difficult levels. But if you wanted to play Aladdin on the NES, Hummer Team's game was the only one worth checking out. Also, as an aside, there's a hack of Hummer Team's Aladdin called Popeye 2 Travels in Persia, and it's literally the same game, but with Popeye's head crudely pasted over Aladdin's. Very subtle. In typical Hummer Team fashion, they still did not lose any steam after Aladdin, and soon followed up with another big NES port, Super Mario World, another one of their most popular titles. This one's a bit strange because the gameplay is not ideal, it's buggy and the running and jumping physics are pretty weird, and there's a lot missing from this bootleg, including entire enemy types and over half of all levels, partly because of technical limitations. But what isn't missing is very faithful, almost to a shocking degree. Hummer Team's port still maintained the overworld map, all the power-up functions, and Yoshi is in the game and works exactly like he does in the original SNES release. Which is a big deal because Nintendo themselves claimed at one point that making Yoshi function on NES hardware would be impossible. Pretty awkward to see the big N getting shown up by a ragtag group of bootleggers. The graphics were basically redrawn from the SNES version, with some assets being reused from Kart Fighter of all places. The music was also redone, but it's unfortunately not that great. Despite all these differences though, Hummer Team's Super Mario World is still one of their best projects, and according to Hummer Chang himself, it took the longest amount of time to develop out of all their games, coming in at over a year. Now that probably doesn't sound like a terribly long time, especially in the current game development landscape where even an indie title can take half a decade to come out, but to Hummer Team, when the dev time of all your other games average at only about 4 months, then a year probably feels like forever. After their brief venture into platformers, it was time for Hummer Team to get back into squeezing more use out of that handy little Street Fighter 2 engine they made, or more specifically, the Kart Fighter version of it. Their next fighting game is obviously another unlicensed port, but not of an SNES or Genesis game. No, a new generation of consoles had arrived, entering the world of 3D. Hummer Team now aimed to make NES ports of games that were on the PlayStation, and in this instance, the game of choice was Tekken. Trying to pass their port off as a sequel yet again though, Hummer Team's game is called Tekken 2, pulling the revolutionary three-dimensional game back into the realm of 2D. There's a total of 8 characters: Heihachi, Nina, Paul, Kazuya, Michelle, King, Law, and Wong. And even though Lei Wulong is featured on the port's cartridge art, he's not actually there. And in the spirit of actual Tekken gameplay, there's no projectiles for any character, and their specials have been replaced by multi-hit combos. Visually, the game of course uses 8-bit pixel art, but in terms of movement and animations, it once again feels surprisingly faithful to the original game. Characters still have their most familiar attacks that will be recognizable to anyone who plays them in the illegitimate version, and stages are neatly recreated for the older console too, using multi-layered scrolling effects to mimic the 3D feeling as best as the NES can handle. For an unlicensed port of a game that's not just 1, but 2 generations ahead, this is yet another respectable effort on Hummer Team's part. Going back to platformers yet again though, Hummer Team once more flexes their skills by making the most accurate and sought-after port of Rare's Donkey Kong Country. This port was released in 1997, and as you would expect, it's titled Donkey Kong Country 4 to pass itself off as a sequel when it's really just a port of the first DKC, albeit with the graphics simplified so the NES can handle the game. And as you may also expect, it's shockingly faithful to the SNES original, even in spite of these necessary downgrades. Both Donkey and Diddy Kong are playable, and the player can switch between them at any time with the select button, but only one of them is present on screen at once, likely due to the console's sprite limitations, and many boss fights are retained. The only notable removals are, unfortunately, animal friends that you would ride through certain levels, and bonus games where the Kongs can score extra bananas or lives. But funnily enough, Hummer Team still recreated their losing animations for these bonus games, and they can be seen within the game's files. Oddly, the save system is also removed and replaced with a password function, which Aladdin also had. This seems like a decent compromise at first, but the problem is that you can only see these passwords once you get a game over, and the game gives you a generous 25 lives. So if you're good at the game, you probably won't ever get your password at all. These changes aside, Donkey Kong Country 4 is the best NES transition of Rare's classic SNES platformer, and just like Hummer Team's version of Aladdin, it's the only NES version worth playing, among other bootleg ports. At this point, entering late 1997 to 98, Hummer Team's activities would slowly wind down, because we're getting further and further away from the height of the NES's popularity, even among bootlegging. We're already well into the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 era, with the PlayStation 2 only a couple years away. But despite the writing on the wall, Hummer Team would still hammer away at some more ports, especially squeezing as much remaining blood from the Street Fighter II engine stone as they could. For example, they released Mortal Kombat 3, an unlicensed NES port of the official game. It featured Liu Kang, Stryker, Nightwolf, Kano, Sub-Zero, Shao Kahn, and Sonya. Interestingly, nothing in this game seems to be reused from Hummer Team's previous MK ports. Weirdly enough though, this game is probably better known by a version featured in multicarts called Mortal Kombat 4, which, despite its title, actually has less content than 3. After that, they released an unlicensed port of The King of Fighters 96, and this one has many more obviously cut corners, because it shares many of the same assets and issues that an earlier port of Street Fighter 02 also had, including garbled sprites at the top of the screen, tons of sprite flickering, and much of the same music. Now thankfully KOF 96 retained the team mode that the legit game has, but Hummer Team's version has a very tiny roster of only 7 characters with 2 recolors each, meaning over 20 characters from the original game are gone. However, 13 characters are still within the game files and can be manually accessed, but their sprites are glitched. Also, the power gauge is gone, so at the end of the day, this game kinda just feels like Street Fighter with a KOF coat of paint. Now after this, Hummer Team's activity truly fell off. Publishers like Ka Shang and JY Company were no longer distributing their games, so their last stretch of titles were released by a small assortment of different companies. And some of these final games were only released in a specific multi-cart called Super New Year 15-in-1, which came out in the very late year of 2005. And it contained games that were made several years prior in the 90s, but didn't see the light of day until now. One of the games on it is a very, very strange one, probably the weirdest one in this entire video. It's not a fighting game, and it's not necessarily a full-blown platformer either. It's a beat-em-up, and it's not based on an existing video game franchise. It's based on a movie, a very popular one that released right around the game's development in 1998 or so. James Cameron's Titanic, or rather, Titanic. In this game, you control Jack, who looks and moves strangely like Kyo from King of Fighters, and Rose as they beat the piss out of crew members and other passengers and various animals not seen in the movie. Jack's portions of the game take place before the ship crashes into the iceberg, and Rose's portions take place after, and you can pick up wine bottles and lobsters to refill your health or gain extra lives. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, this is still an unlicensed game though, and has to be based on another legit game, right? What is it? And you would be somewhat correct in that assumption. Titanic seems to be made on its own engine. Hummer Team decided to not reuse the Somari or Street Fighter 2 engines for the umpteenth time, but the human enemies specifically are taken from the SNES game The Mask, based on the Jim Carrey movie. Titanic's history still gets more complicated. Originally, the game was supposed to be published on its own instead of bundled in a multi-cart by publisher Ka Shang, who had distributed the last few Hummer Team fighting games that we talked about before Titanic. But because of the NES's dwindling popularity, Ka Shang decided that they were no longer interested in games for that platform, forcing Hummer Team to hold on to Titanic until they finally found a way to release it. That's when the Super New Year 15-in-1 multi-cart comes in and is the first documented release of this odd beat-em-up. But it still doesn't stop there. The unaltered, full version of the game supposedly existed on a different multi-cart published by AB Soft called the Super Cool Boy 3-in-1, which is so rare that people in the bootleg community simply assumed it was unreleased, until it was discovered and dumped online in 2021, 23 years after the development of the game. After they began winding down on NES games, Hummer Team switched their focus to making plug-and-play systems. Simple little devices with the software built into them so you can just plug the console into the TV and play through a small library of included games. One of Hummer Team's creations was the Somari 60-in-1, released in 2006, a machine that took the silhouette of an original Xbox controller and contained the VT03 chipset, which is a single-chip Famiclone developed by VR Technology, another Taiwanese chip manufacturer. The Somari contained a whopping 60 minigames, and most of them are original, with a few being based on isolated sections from previous Hummer Team games. There was also the Z-Dog, another plug-and-play machine that featured a toy dog that contained the system hardware in its backpack. It uses the same VT03 chipset as the Somari and has 44 games instead of 60. After the release of these plug-and-play consoles, Hummer Team basically disappeared. It was 2006, and we were entering the age of HD gaming, and the demand for NES clones and bootlegs were dwindling. They couldn't really sustain themselves on unlicensed NES ports anymore. Hummer Chang himself has become a fairly elusive figure since then, with only a few instances of documented correspondence between himself and a fan who was somehow able to track him down. That correspondence was how some of the information in this very video came to light. In more recent years, interest in retro gaming seems to have swung back around. Devices dedicated to emulation of old consoles and handhelds are more popular than ever, ranging from the more pricey and premium hardware-focused machines like the Polymega and Analog Pocket to the more accessible software-focused machines like the Miu Mini Plus, Anbernic RG35XX, and Retroid Pocket 4. People in the gaming community overall have gained a greater interest in experiencing and preserving the past, including me. I've made no shortage of videos about the importance of maintaining access to old games, and while some people might argue that bootlegs aren't as crucial to gaming history as legitimate games, groups like Hummer Team have made their mark within their own community because of their dedication, influence, and the surprising quality of some of their titles. After all, they made an unlicensed port of Aladdin that was better than the official thing, and they made shockingly faithful ports of Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat 2, Super Mario World, and Donkey Kong Country. And the engines those games were made on would go on to be used by other hackers and bootleggers to make their own games, some of which were pretty damn ambitious in their own right. The folks at Hummer Team absolutely had talent, and I would rather they use that talent on bootlegs than not use it at all. They have their spot in the annals of gaming history, just as any legitimate developer does. This concludes my video on the games of Hummer Team. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.